January 1943. Western Pacific. Beneath the surface, a Japanese submarine moves slowly through black water. Inside the steel hull, the air is stale. Condensation drips from riveted seams. Every sound is magnified. The hum of electric motors, the faint creak of pressure against metal. The boat is running deep. Too deep to see, too deep to escape quickly. Then it begins. A distant pulse, a rhythmic echo traveling through water. Not heard with ears, but felt through the bones of the ship. Sonar. The submarine dives further. Ballast tanks flood. The hull groans as the ocean tightens its grip. Somewhere above, unseen American destroyers are no longer guessing. They are measuring, calculating speed, depth, angle. Second stretch. The first explosion does not hit the hull. It does not need to. Water compresses violently. Light bulbs shatter. Instruments jump. Men are thrown from their stations as the ocean itself becomes a weapon. More detonations follow, closer now. Relentless. Methodical. This is no surface battle. No guns. No smoke. Only pressure, darkness, and waiting. And in that waiting lies the realization spreading through Japan's submarine fleet that the balance beneath the sea has quietly shifted. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, Japan entered the conflict with immense confidence in its navy. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been built around a single decisive idea, a climactic fleet battle that would destroy the enemy in one overwhelming stroke. Battleships and aircraft carriers stood at the center of that vision. Submarines, by contrast, were seen as supporting instruments, tools to thin enemy fleets before the final encounter, not weapons of economic strangulation or prolonged attrition. This philosophy shaped everything that followed. Japanese submarines were among the most advanced in the world at the start of the war. Long-ranged, fast on the surface, and capable of carrying heavy torpedoes, they were engineered to scout ahead of the main fleet and attack major warships. Their commanders trained to hunt carriers and battleships, not merchant convoys. Their missions were offensive, precise, and brief. The United States Navy entered the war from a very different position. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered the American battle line and exposed a vulnerability that had been long underestimated: the vast distances of the Pacific and the fragile lifelines that crossed it. Oil from California, troops from Australia, food and ammunition bound for island outposts. All of it moved by sea. Without protection, these routes were exposed. In the first months of 1942, American anti-submarine defenses were weak. Escort vessels were scarce. Sonar operators were inexperienced. Depth charges existed, but their deployment was often improvised, inaccurate, and poorly coordinated. Japanese submarines exploited these gaps with ease. In the waters around Hawaii, the West Coast, and the South Pacific, American shipping losses mounted. Tankers burned. Freighters disappeared without warning. Survivors spoke of torpedoes striking from nowhere. Yet despite these early successes, Japan's submarine strategy carried a fatal flaw. While German U-boats in the Atlantic focused relentlessly on commerce destruction, Japanese submarines rarely targeted merchant traffic systematically. They pursued warships instead, even when unescorted transports passed within reach. Strategic doctrine, reinforced by tradition and pride, discouraged deviation. Each submarine was expected to play a role in a future decisive naval battle that never came. Meanwhile, the United States was learning. American naval planners understood that they could not match Japan's ship for ship in the early months, but they could adapt faster. Shipyards worked around the clock. Training programs expanded. Escort destroyers, patrol craft, and converted civilian vessels were pressed into service. Most importantly, anti-submarine warfare was no longer treated as a secondary task. It became a priority. By mid-1942, the tide of the war had begun to change above the water. The Battle of Midway halted Japan's carrier advance. Guadalcanal turned into a brutal contest of endurance. As surface engagements drained resources and attention, a quieter struggle intensified below the waves, one that would prove just as decisive. American engineers refined sonar systems capable of holding contact with submerged targets. Radar sets extended detection range on the surface. Communication between ships improved, allowing coordinated attacks rather than isolated guesses. Submarines were no longer invisible. They were becoming trackable. And at the center of this transformation stood a simple, devastating weapon, unchanged in concept, but evolving rapidly in execution. The depth charge, originally little more than an explosive barrel dropped over a ship's stern. It was now being redesigned, standardized, and deployed with increasing precision. Adjustable fuses allowed detonation at specific depths. Patterns could be laid ahead of a submarine's projected path, boxing it in rather than chasing blindly behind. For Japanese crews accustomed to slipping away undetected, the ocean was becoming less forgiving. The change did not come all at once. At first, submariners dismissed the explosions as crude harassment. Near misses were survivable. Hulls held. Crews endured. But with each patrol, the attacks grew tighter, more accurate, more persistent. The Americans were no longer reacting. They were hunting. And as Japanese submarines ventured deeper into contested waters in late 1942, the reality they faced was no longer one of opportunity, but of exposure. That exposure would soon become impossible to ignore. By late 1942, the United States Navy had accepted a hard truth. Victory in the Pacific would not be decided by singular battles alone. It would be decided by control of sea lanes, of logistics, and of the invisible spaces beneath the surface. To achieve that control, anti-submarine warfare had to become systematic, disciplined, and relentless. America possessed one advantage Japan could not match: industrial scale combined with adaptability. Shipyards across the continental United States began turning out escort vessels in numbers that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Destroyer escorts, smaller and cheaper than fleet destroyers, were designed specifically for submarine hunting. Their mission was not speed or firepower, but endurance and coordination. They could remain with convoys for weeks, maintaining a protective screen across thousands of miles. Training changed as well. Sonar operators were no longer taught simply to detect a contact, but to maintain it under stress. They learned how sound traveled through thermoclines, how depth affected echo strength, how a submarine might maneuver to break contact. Mistakes were analyzed, procedures standardized. What had once been guesswork became doctrine. Depth charges evolved in parallel. American depth charges were now manufactured with consistent explosive yields and reliable hydrostatic pistols. Crews could set them to detonate at precise depths, 100 feet, 200 feet, deeper still, depending on sonar readings. Attacks were no longer random drops, but planned patterns, calculated to deny escape routes. Instead of a single explosion behind a ship, submarines now faced rolling barges that shook the water itself. New delivery methods further tilted the balance. Stern racks allowed rapid release of multiple charges, while side-mounted projectors, known as K-guns, threw explosives outward, widening the kill zone. A submarine attempting to slip beneath a destroyer could now find itself surrounded by detonations from every direction. Perhaps most critically, American ships began working together. Rather than breaking off after a single pass, escort groups maintained pressure. One vessel would hold sonar contact while others maneuvered into attack positions. If a submarine dove deeper, depth settings were adjusted. If it turned, the pattern shifted. There was no longer safety in endurance. Every maneuver consumed battery power, compressed air, and oxygen. Japanese submariners felt the change almost immediately. Reports from late 1942 and early 1943 described attacks that lasted for hours. Crews recorded dozens of explosions in succession, each closer than the last. Hulls buckled, valves leaked, rivets popped. Men fought rising panic in near darkness as electrical systems failed and the air grew foul. Yet Japanese command struggled to grasp the full implications. Submarine losses were often attributed to bad luck or individual error. There was little institutional acknowledgement that the enemy had fundamentally changed the underwater battlefield. Tactical adjustments were slow. Equipment upgrades lagged. Coordination between submarines and surface forces remained limited. Meanwhile, American confidence grew. By 1943, U.S. Navy escorts were sinking Japanese submarines at an accelerating rate across the Solomon Islands, the Bismarck Sea, and the approaches to major Japanese supply routes. Each sinking reinforced doctrine. Each success refined technique. Depth charges were no longer blunt instruments. They were precise tools of pressure and destruction. For Japanese crews, the psychological impact was profound. Submarines had once been predators, silent, elusive, in control of when to strike and when to vanish. Now, they were being pursued from the moment they were detected. The sea no longer offered concealment. It offered confinement. Below the surface, the enemy could not be seen, but his presence was constant. Sonar pings echoed like a heartbeat that would not stop. Every explosion carried the same message. Escape was becoming less likely with each passing minute. This growing imbalance between hunter and hunted, between evolving technology and rigid doctrine, set the stage for a series of encounters that would define the underwater war in the Pacific. And it is within those encounters that the true human, tactical, and technological dimensions of America's depth bombs came fully into view. For the men inside Japanese submarines, depth charge attacks were not experienced as explosions alone. They were endured as prolonged assaults on the body and mind. A submarine under attack could not fight back. It could only evade. Crews shut down engines, reduced speed to a crawl, and sat in near silence while listening for the next detonation. Every object inside the hull became a potential weapon. Tools fell from racks. Batteries cracked. Acid fumes leaked into the air. Lights failed without warning, plunging compartments into darkness. Pressure worked relentlessly against the steel hull. With each nearby explosion, the submarine flexed inward, then outward again. Men described the sensation as being crushed and released repeatedly, unsure which cycle would be the last. Sleep became impossible. Time lost meaning. Attacks could last minutes or stretch into hours, until exhaustion replaced fear. Oxygen levels dropped as systems were shut down to reduce noise. Carbon dioxide rose. Sailors fainted at their stations. Commanders had to balance survival against suffocation, knowing that every movement increased the chance of detection. Unlike surface combat, there were no visual cues, no horizon, no smoke, no enemy silhouette. The threat existed only as sound and vibration. This invisibility magnified terror. Submariners could not see what was killing them. They could only wait. For many, the psychological toll was as destructive as the explosions themselves. American depth charges were deceptively simple in appearance. Cylindrical steel casings filled with high explosive. Their power came not from direct impact, but from physics. When a depth charge detonated underwater, it created a massive pressure wave. Water, incompressible by nature, transmitted that force outward in all directions. Even without a direct hit, the shock could rupture hull seams, disable machinery, and damage internal systems. A submarine did not need to be torn apart to be killed. It only needed to be rendered helpless. By 1943, American depth charges were equipped with adjustable hydrostatic pistols, allowing precise depth control. Sonar readings informed fuse settings, transforming guesswork into calculated assault. A submarine diving deeper to escape only placed itself within a new range of lethal pressure. Pattern bombing amplified this effect. Multiple charges detonated in sequence, overlapping pressure waves that magnified structural stress. Even the strongest hulls could not endure repeated shock without failure. What stunned Japanese crews was not a single devastating blast, but the persistence. One explosion led to another, and another. The ocean itself became the weapon. American destroyer and escort crews quickly learned that submarines could endure brief attacks. What they could not endure was sustained pursuit. Instead of making one pass and breaking contact, escorts stayed close. Sonar operators maintained continuous tracking. Helm orders adjusted minute by minute. Depth charge runs were calculated not to destroy immediately, but to exhaust the submarine, forcing it deeper, slower, and eventually into mistakes. A damaged submarine leaked oil. A leaking submarine left a trail. Once detected, escape became a matter of probability, not skill. The concept of the kill shifted. Sinking the submarine was the final outcome, but the true objective was dominance, control of depth, time, and pressure. Submarines were no longer free actors. They were confined targets within a three-dimensional trap. And as these tactics matured, Japanese commanders began to realize that something far more dangerous than a new weapon was emerging. A system, one that would soon be examined from the perspectives of leadership, enemy doctrine, and the moral weight of invisible warfare. At the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy, submarine losses were difficult to interpret and even harder to accept. Pre-war doctrine had elevated submarines as elite instruments, operated by highly trained crews, and expected to strike decisive blows against enemy warships. This belief did not dissolve easily. Reports of sustained depth charge attacks were often filtered through layers of command that emphasized individual encounters rather than systemic change. A submarine loss might be attributed to mechanical failure, navigational error, or overwhelming odds, rather than to an enemy who had mastered a new method of warfare. As a result, institutional response lagged behind reality. Unlike the U.S. Navy, which centralized lessons learned and disseminated them rapidly, Japanese naval command remained compartmentalized. Tactical innovation moved slowly. Sonar technology lagged. Radar integration remained limited. Escort coordination was underdeveloped. Submarines continued to operate largely alone, even as the enemy hunted in groups. By 1943, some officers privately questioned whether Japanese submarine doctrine had become obsolete. But tradition, combined with a shortage of resources and growing pressure on all fronts, limited the scope of reform. Submariners were asked to endure conditions for which doctrine had not prepared them. For American sailors, depth charge warfare was not glamorous. It was repetitive, exhausting, and often emotionally distant. There was no visible enemy, no confirmation of success beyond oil slicks, debris, or sonar silence. Yet this detachment reinforced discipline. American escort crews trusted their instruments. Sonar contacts were treated as data points, not guesses. Attacks followed checklists. Reports were logged. Patterns repeated. When a submarine was destroyed, confirmation came hours or days later, sometimes through intelligence intercepts or missing enemy patrols. This procedural mindset proved decisive. Depth charge attacks were not driven by rage or fear, but by methodical execution. Each sinking validated the system. Each failure refined it. Over time, Japanese submarines were no longer viewed as unpredictable threats. They were assessed as problems with solutions. Submarine warfare removed combatants from one another entirely. Men killed without seeing who killed them. Crews perished without their enemy ever knowing their faces. Depth charges intensified this separation. American sailors never witnessed the moment of destruction. Japanese submariners never saw their attackers. The sea absorbed everything, sound, light, evidence. For those inside the submarines, death came without spectacle. There were no last stands, no final shots. Only crushing pressure, flooding compartments, and silence. This moral distance made the war efficient. It also made it unforgiving. By 1944, the underwater conflict had become a contest not of courage alone, but of endurance against an enemy who could apply pressure indefinitely. And it was in that pressure, applied again and again across the Pacific, that the decisive moments of the submarine war finally emerged. Moments where evasion failed, hulls gave way, and the outcome of the underwater struggle could no longer be denied. By early 1943, the underwater war in the Pacific had entered a new phase, one defined not by isolated encounters, but by sustained destruction. The turning point did not arrive in a single explosion or one dramatic sinking. It emerged gradually, as patterns became unmistakable and survival rates collapsed. In the waters surrounding the Solomon Islands, Japanese submarines faced an environment that had become actively hostile. American escort groups now guarded transport routes to Guadalcanal and beyond, moving in coordinated screens. Destroyers and destroyer escorts operated in rotating patrols, overlapping coverage so that a submarine evading one contact often surfaced into another. One engagement followed another. Japanese submarines attempting to shadow American task forces found themselves detected earlier and held longer. Sonar contact was rarely lost once established. When a submarine dove, escorts adjusted speed and spacing. Depth charges were set deeper. Patterns widened. The ocean offered no blind corner. Records from 1943 describe attacks lasting 4, 5, even 6 hours. Explosions marched across the water in precise intervals. Hull integrity weakened incrementally. Pumps struggled to keep up with leaks. Batteries failed under shock. Commanders were forced to choose between surfacing under fire or remaining submerged until air ran out. In April 1943, several Japanese submarines operating near the Solomon Sea vanished without distress signals. Post-war analysis confirmed what crews had already sensed. Depth charge effectiveness had reached a threshold. Near misses were no longer survivable indefinitely. Structural fatigue accumulated. A submarine that escaped one barrage was often fatally compromised for the next. American reports noted a change as well. Sonar operators described clearer echoes. Oil slicks appeared more frequently. Debris surfaced, wooden planking, personal effects, fragments of pressure hull plating. Kill confirmations increased. Escort commanders began to trust that persistence, not luck, would produce results. As the year progressed, U.S. Navy hunter-killer groups were formed around escort carriers. Aircraft expanded the reach of anti-submarine warfare, forcing Japanese submarines to remain submerged longer, draining batteries before contact with surface ships even occurred. Once trapped below, depth charges finished the work. The Japanese submarine fleet once intended to shape the outcome of the Pacific War, was now being consumed by it. Yet command in Tokyo still hoped endurance might carry the day. Submarines were ordered to maintain patrols, to supply isolated garrisons, to attempt attacks against increasingly defended targets. Each mission carried higher risk. Each loss reduced experience that could not be replaced. By mid-1944, the cumulative effect became undeniable. The balance beneath the sea had not merely shifted, it had collapsed. And still, the most devastating encounters were yet to come, as American depth bombing reached its peak efficiency and Japanese crews confronted the full, inescapable consequences of a war they could no longer hide from. By late 1944, American anti-submarine warfare had reached a level of coordination that left little margin for survival. Depth charges were no longer deployed as reactions to fleeting contacts. They were the final phase of a tightly controlled process that began with detection and ended with destruction. Japanese submarines operating in the Philippine Sea and the approaches to the home islands encountered an environment saturated with sensors. Radar-equipped aircraft forced them to dive before they could observe targets. Sonar-equipped escorts waited below. Once contact was made, the sequence unfolded with mechanical precision. An escort would hold sonar contact, while others maneuvered ahead of the submarine's projected course. Depth settings were adjusted in real time. Charges detonated above, beside, and beneath the target. Pressure waves overlapped, amplifying damage. Escape routes disappeared. Several documented sinkings from this period illustrate the finality of the system. Submarines that attempted emergency surfacing were met with gunfire. Those that remained submerged succumbed to flooding, loss of propulsion, or catastrophic hull failure. In some cases, explosions forced submarines past their crushed depth, ending resistance instantly. Japanese patrol reports grew shorter. Radio transmissions ceased abruptly. Boats failed to return from missions with increasing regularity. By early 1945, experienced submarine commanders were gone, replaced by crews with minimal training and little expectation of survival. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors of depth charge attacks described a sense of inevitability. Once detected, the question was no longer if destruction would come, but when. The ocean, once an ally, had become a confined execution chamber. For the United States Navy, these outcomes confirmed the success of an approach built on coordination, technology, and endurance. Anti-submarine warfare had matured into a science. Depth bombs were its most visible expression, but the true weapon was the system that delivered them. By the final months of the war, Japanese submarines posed little threat to American operations. Supply lines flowed with increasing security. Amphibious assaults proceeded with reduced risk from below. The turning point had passed quietly, without headlines or ceremonies. It was marked not by victory parades, but by empty ocean where submarines once operated freely. And when the pressure finally eased, the consequences of that silent collapse began to surface. When the explosion stopped, what remained was absence. Why in 1944 and in 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine force had been reduced to a shadow of its pre-war strength. Dozens of boats were missing, their losses inferred not from wreckage but from silence. Missed radio check-ins, patrols that never concluded, crews that never returned. Post-war assessments confirmed that American anti-submarine forces had destroyed a significant portion of Japan's operational submarines, many through sustained depth charge attacks rather than single decisive blows. The strategic consequences were immediate. Japanese submarines had been expected to disrupt American logistics, threaten invasion forces, and supply isolated island garrisons. Instead, those missions became increasingly impossible. American convoys crossed the Pacific with growing confidence. Fuel, ammunition, and troops arrived in quantities that overwhelmed Japanese defensive planning. Isolated Japanese forces suffered acutely. Garrisons bypassed by advancing Allied forces depended on submarines for food and medicine. As submarine losses mounted, these supply efforts collapsed. Starvation and disease followed, not from direct attack, but from the severing of underwater lifelines. Numerically, the trend was unmistakable. Japanese submarine losses accelerated sharply after 1943. Experienced crews were irreplaceable. Training programs could not keep pace with attrition. Boats launched late in the war entered service with poorly trained personnel and outdated equipment, facing an enemy at peak efficiency. Psychologically, the damage was just as severe. Survivors of depth-charge attacks reported long-term trauma. The sound of explosions, the memory of pressure and darkness, followed them long after the war ended. For those still serving, morale deteriorated. Submarine patrols were no longer viewed as elite assignments, but as near-certain risks with little strategic payoff. American forces, by contrast, experienced a growing sense of control. Anti-submarine warfare became routine. Escort crews rotated through patrols confident in their procedures and equipment. Losses at sea declined. The threat from below, once unpredictable and deadly, was now largely contained. Yet the aftermath was not merely one of victory and defeat. It was also a transformation in naval warfare itself. Depth charges had proven that the underwater domain could be dominated, not by individual brilliance, but by systems, coordination, and persistence. That realization would shape not only the remainder of the Pacific War, but every naval doctrine that followed. In the months following Japan's collapse, naval analysts on both sides began to understand what had truly happened beneath the surface of the Pacific. The destruction of Japan's submarine force was not the result of a single breakthrough weapon, but of an accumulated imbalance that had grown irreversible. American depth-charge warfare had achieved something unprecedented. It had made the ocean transparent. Submarines could no longer rely on depth, darkness, or patience. Every advantage they once held had been countered, then surpassed. Sonar denied concealment. Radar denied surprise. Aircraft denied freedom of movement. Depth charges denied endurance. The combined effect rendered Japanese submarines operationally obsolete long before the war ended. Japanese post-war naval reviews acknowledged these failures indirectly. Reports noted inadequate coordination, delayed technological adoption, and an over-reliance on pre-war doctrine. There was no single moment of admission, but the evidence was unmistakable. Submarines designed for a decisive fleet battle had been destroyed by a war of attrition they were never meant to fight. For the United States Navy, the lessons were absorbed quickly and permanently. Anti-submarine warfare became a core discipline. Depth charges were refined further, eventually giving way to more advanced weapons, but their legacy endured. The principles of layer detection, sustained pressure, and cooperative engagement became foundational. The human cost, however, lingered beyond doctrine. Thousands of Japanese submariners died without witnesses. Their graves were the ocean itself. No final reports, no recovery. Their disappearance was recorded only in logs and missing patrol lists. Even in victory, American sailors understood the finality of what had occurred. Many spoke of the strange quiet after a confirmed sinking, an absence that felt heavier than celebration. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Japanese submarines no longer influenced the course of events. The underwater war had already been decided. Amphibious landings proceeded with minimal interference. Supply routes remained intact. The Pacific belonged to the Allies, above and below the surface. What remained was reflection, a recognition that modern warfare had entered a phase where distance, invisibility, and pressure could destroy entire forces without spectacle. And it was within that recognition that the final meaning of America's depth bombs began to take shape. The story of America's depth bombs is not one of sudden triumph or dramatic invention. It is the story of pressure applied patiently, methodically, and without pause. Beneath the Pacific, victory did not come from courage alone. It came from systems, networks of sound, steel, training, and endurance. Depth charges were simple weapons, but they were delivered with precision born of learning and adaptation. Each explosion represented not just force, but understanding. For Japanese submariners, the war revealed a harsh truth about modern conflict. Skill and bravery could not compensate for doctrine that refused to evolve. The sea, once a sanctuary, became a confined space governed by physics rather than hope. In that space, survival depended less on will than on preparation. The underwater war also exposed the emotional distance of industrialized combat. Men died without seeing their enemy. Victory was measured in silence and absence. There were no battlefields to walk, no monuments to raise. Only coordinates on charts and names in records. Yet the legacy of this struggle extended far beyond World War II. The principles forged in those dark waters reshaped naval warfare for generations. Anti-submarine doctrine became central to global strategy. The ocean was no longer unknowable. It was monitored, measured, and contested. In the end, America's depth bombs did not merely sink submarines. They changed the relationship between humanity and the deep, transforming it from a place of concealment into a domain of constant tension. And in that silent transformation, the Pacific War found one of its most decisive and least visible conclusions.